for organizing this. I think I can say Nat now. I've been hearing others call you Nat. For Rod for all the work here, and Katie for putting. I mean, this I will genuinely say. I'm not bullshitting you. I truly think this is one of the more unique conferences doing what I think is one of the most important things. So let's grow this thing. Let's make this happen. So thank you. I say that with all genuineness and humility too, which is another one of the big thing, the sort of values and virtues that I think we have for this area. At the end of my course that I teach with Carl, calling bullshit, I explain to the students that the value in these skills is not just in making you smarter. It's in making your community, your family, and your friends smarter. So if you're sitting at the dinner table and all you are is the I call sort of the well actually guy, well actually, I know something you don't know, then you're not really, you don't have the spirit, as Guillermo had mentioned before in your talk. We need that critical spirit, and that involves the humility, and it involves making others smarter, not just ourselves. So I really believe in that strongly. And also, what I'm going to talk about today is that I don't think critical thinking is just an individual thing. I think critical thinking as a very social activity. So many of the education games, many of the things that I've been working on have been really getting at that social side. So when I talk about AI being a part of the equation now, it's another agent in our social system, and we have to be aware of its strengths and we have to be aware of its weaknesses, both as a rational thinker. Well, that's going to be debated. I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's call it some form of thinking on its own, and also thinking with us as a complement. But the main thing that I want to convey is that critical thinking really matters, and I don't have to tell everyone that, but we do rapid response research. And a lot of you have probably been following the horrible floods that have been happening in Texas. And we track a lot of the rumors. One of the things I study, when people say, what do you do? It used to be, well, I study misinformation. But really what I do and what my colleagues do in our center, we study rumors. It's easier, it's more palatable when I talk to the public about that. It's easier when talking to politicians. And it's easier when you get sued, like I've been many times, and have to talk about it to other people. Don't worry, we've won those lawsuits. But what happened in Texas, and what is happening, this was just written in Wired, I think it was yesterday or the day before, there are groups that are so concerned that the next RAD weather systems, these are the next generation weather radar systems, that allow you to detect precipitation, wind, etc. within tornadoes, they believe that those systems are the things that caused the flooding. And this is an ongoing rumor, and these rumors evolve and they change depending on the crisis and depending on the particular situation. But they believe it so much, it's not just that they go home and talk about it with their friends. In Oklahoma City, they had a break-in. So a group that was reported in this story and has been reported in multiple stories has even hasn't fully said that they wouldn't do such a thing as long as they're not harming people. They're going in and they've got these people on cameras, breaking the equipment, and there have been many, many, many death threats. So this is why critical thinking matters. And we see this in the work that we do, because we do what's called rapid response research. As new things arise, like when the Maui fires arise, we start tracking the ways that these rumors are traveling. So it gives me a population level view of how misinformation finds its way into different communities and the effects it has on communities. But it also allows me to inform the education that I feel most passionate about, which is teaching us humans how to become better consumers and producers of information. Most of the time, most of my research time and education time and teaching time and time in policy is thinking or spending in the darker corners of the internet. And that can give you a kind of a darker view of the world, which is why coming to conferences like this, talking with people that are trying to do something about it, really does give me optimism. But what I found in these years studying this in our center, and we have, several dozen researchers, so we have about 40 to 50 researchers. These include students, postdocs, faculty, research scientists, etc. We have to even set rules in place so that you go into these different communities and conspiracy theory lands with another individual and have limits, and we have psychologists to work with some of our researchers, because these things can be so convincing and so disorienting. If you study these, study within these communities, especially communities where it's far beyond just flat Earth, that deals with much more difficult things like war, it can be very challenging, and so we have to build rules now as we study this kind of information. And the reason I say that is that, again, even those that study misinformation are susceptible to misinformation, because we've had students actually, they don't know what to believe anymore. So we've had to be careful about that. So we formed this center, my colleagues and I, back in 2019, but of course we've been working on it for many years before. Some of my colleagues have been doing crisis informatics for many, many years. My colleague Carl Berkson and I had been talking about this issue of misinformation, mostly within science and around data, for many years before this. Our approach, at least my approach, it takes a computational social science view of things. We usually have gather large public data, and we look at the way that rumors spread. We study these dynamics and the effects that platforms have on them, the effects that the social systems themselves, the effect, the content itself on these systems. Here's a paper that one of the students that visited our lab, Mallory Harris, led, that looks at these various, these are the pro-vaccination, anti-vaccination groups online during COVID. And what we wanted to do in this particular study, and I'll show a little bit of details later, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of research that we do, we were looking at the role that expertise, which are the nodes that are darker, what role they played in governing the conversations in these different communities. We also do a lot of real fast-paced, like I said, temporal work, where we're looking at the rise of these different rumors and the virality of one rumor versus another, and the individuals themselves that actually are amplifying those kinds of rumors. My colleagues and I have done a bunch of work on policy, actually, so this interaction of policy and research and education is really what drives most of the work that we do. So this was a deepfake bill that we passed in the state of Washington that then moved its way through other states, and this itself was actually mimicking the California state law. So it's been fun to take the work that we learn online or in these different media environments and then see them into policy. And then it's really forced me over the years to keep asking this question over and over. How do you solve a problem like misinformation? Now, of course, you can't solve misinformation. It's always going to be there. But what's important is that as we develop education curriculum and as we build recommendations for policymakers, we really need to be thinking about these important distinctions. Here's just a sampling. It's important for a policymaker, for example, to know the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation being sort of, the general definition is just generally anything that's false, whereas disinformation has this intent involved. And they're very different. It turns out it's very difficult to study disinformation campaigns because they're sprinkled with truth. They have this strategic element that's hard to measure because measuring intent is very difficult. But when you do identify it, it's very different. And we should be teaching critical thinking and certainly media literacy in ways that are different when we distinguish between those two. I won't go into speech and action and things and all these others. But the other one that's important also is just mistaken belief and conviction. And Joe talked about that yesterday. When you're working with someone that can actually change belief by giving them new information, that's a whole different strategy than when you're dealing with people that are truly convicted in their beliefs. And many of the people and groups we've dealt with have true convictions. That's a very different ballgame. So we really mix this research, policy, education, and engagement. It's what drives our center. At their core really is research. But I'm going to talk mostly about, for this talk, around kind of 3 different areas that are in education. So we, for many years, have been running different media literacy programs that, of course, integrate critical thinking, many of the things that actually a lot of you have done, and I've actually used and borrowed, so thank you for the work that you've done. But we run like a program, for example, every year where we bring thousands of high school kids to campus or virtually to campus, and we spend an entire day talking about misinformation. And the reason why we have to do that is because there's no standard or requirement in the state of Washington and most parts of the United States for media literacy. Now that's changed, as I mentioned yesterday. There are now requirements. We just don't have the details figured out, and I think that's the opportunity that I was saying to Katie, that we could maybe really integrate some of the ideas that we have around critical reasoning into that kind of curriculum. And I love creating games. I've created a lot of different games over the years to bring public attention to our changing media environment. Back in, I think, 2018, a long time ago, it seems like a long time ago, almost definitely a lifetime ago, it seems, Carl and I created this game called Which Face is Real, which was to bring public attention to style guns. This was essentially the early beginnings of deepfakes, and actually some of the early deepfake technology was developed at my university, so I got to have insight to it, and I wanted to bring attention to how good this technology was. It was a simple game. One of the images was real, one of them's not, created from these style GANs. You can tell me which is real or not, and then it just went viral, and it was played millions and millions of times around the world, and we could gain insight into how you could actually invoke different kinds of teaching methods about what these deepfakes, what might be revealed by a deepfake versus a real image, and you could see how people were changing. And so this is an opportunity. This really sort of taught me the different ways that you could use games. So we've created escape rooms which focus on the social side of the learning and not just the individual side of trying to critically think through problems that you'll see online. And as I mentioned, what's really been hit in my head over and over and over is that critical thinking, at least for me, both in my personal world and what I've found in developing curriculum and doing research in this area, is how important that social element of critical thinking is. We have to be thinking about that as we develop these kinds of things. And many of you in your classes are doing that with the interactive exercises, etc. And as I mentioned yesterday, media literacy and critical thinking really can work together. They're not the same exact thing. There's overlap. Media literacy, as the name implies, really focuses on different media forms. And if you look at the old-fashioned media literacy, which is still in the school, the little that is in schools, really focuses on things like, don't trust Wikipedia. I'm like, no, actually, Wikipedia is one of the few places you might be able to trust. Students come to our Miss Info Day and they say, well, I know something. Don't trust media literacy, or don't trust Wikipedia. I'm like, is that all you know? We can update our media literacy for sure, and then also, of course, overlap that. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to kind of break the talk into three different sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the new things I've learned from research that's informing some of what I think are kind of some new things we're experimenting on media literacy. Then I'm going to weave back into critical thinking, some of the work that I did with Calling BS, and then I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of the time on, I think, what is our future world of AI and large language models and how that could affect how we're doing critical thinking. So the first point I want to make is that expertise matters both in consensus groups, that's a group that's usually pro-science, and counter-consensus group. And I'm going to refer back to this image that I had up initially. And the work that we do when studying these kinds of things online, as you can imagine, it's quite different than what we do in science itself. In science, we have these papers, they go through peer review. There we have reports, and we have systematic reviews, and we have some variance for sure, but online there's a lot more variance in typology of how science is communicated. And if we're going to try to study this interface of how the public engages with science, and certainly we saw a massive increase of that engagement during COVID, we have to be paying attention to these different modalities and really try to come up with typologies that allow us to study these kinds of things. And we see it more than just a journal. We see them, of course, on YouTube and videos. We see them in blogs. We see them in unsourced science. We do see a lot of the same kinds of norms and institutions in the conversations, though. That's a little bit interesting in that, certainly during COVID, RCT even had like a hashtag, and the RCTs were then weaponized, random control trials were weaponized to knock down science that people didn't like, which was interesting all in itself. But as we studied the effect of what expertise was in counter-consensus groups, my initial thought was that it wouldn't play as important a role because they were kind of anti-science, at least that was my view. Boy, was I wrong. The role that expertise played in pro-science, so when someone is a doctor, when they're a professor, when they're a head of CDC, that's important for pro-science. But it's really important also, at least from this study that we did and published recently, it really is important also in the counter-consensus group. It's just that they have different experts. And what's most interesting is that when we looked at different contentious topics, sometimes both communities were citing the exact same studies, but saying completely different things. The exact same studies. In fact, one that really stuck in my head was one around debates of whether masks were effective or not. And the two groups pushing that kept citing the same paper, and I thought, and it was actually even talked about on the Tucker Carlson show, and it was being cited over and over from both groups to say, see, we're right. And it was the same study. So, and a lot of times the expertise when we look at expertise in general too, like anti-vaccination, pro-vaccination, we can look at what they share too. And if you look at like the proportion of links that were low quality, yes, we did see more of those in the anti-vaccination community, as you can see in the top row, and the users sharing low quality links. And we have ways of measuring that. But if you look at those that are sharing academic links, at least of the experts within these different groups, it was not that different between those in the counter consensus and those in the consensus group. So what that told me, a big take home here, is that expertise still matters and we still need to lean into it. And that's why I'm still befuddled by what to do with expertise, as I mentioned yesterday in one of the questions that was initiated by the conversations that were happening yesterday. The other big thing that I've learned over the years engaging with the public around these issues and studying it is that evidence is not enough. In critical thinking, we talk a lot about the importance of evidence. I'm a trained scientist. I've spent my entire career within the science enterprise. I love science. I've been one of the biggest fans of science since I was a little kid. And evidence is a big part of what we talk about. But when we talk about evidence on the internet and the things we study on the internet, everyone has evidence. There's infinite evidence on the internet. In fact, we play a game. I used to play this game in my class where I would challenge the students to come up with a question on Google that you cannot get evidence for, that you cannot get an answer for. So as an example, I'll do one here. This was an old one, but it's an old one and a goodie, I guess. Everyone, of course, finds some reason that vaccinations aren't safe in many of these groups, and so we thought, okay, we could at least ask, do vaccination cause shaken baby syndrome? We're pretty sure we know what shaken baby syndrome is. That can't be vaccine caused, right? Do the search, lo and behold, shaken baby syndrome, National Vaccine Information Center, dangerous vaccines found to cause symptoms of shaken baby, on and on and on and on and on. You basically can find evidence for everything. And what that causes, and there's some that study in this field have names where they call it data voids. I kind of think of it more as a fact-checking void. In the health world, the health industry doesn't have time to keep up with every kind of rumor out there. And when there's rumors out there that have not been responded to, there will be answers and there will be evidence because people Google it. If they Google it, there must be an answer. And during COVID, I've been working more and more with these health organizations. And one story that really stuck in my head was that there was a patient that came into a hospital close to where I lived. In Seattle, we were the hospital near my house was the first place in the United States to have detected a COVID patient. And they had created protocols, and the protocol was that after the nose swabs, after the detection kits came in, you then had to take a nose swab. That these things are sterilized with ethylene oxide. And ethylene oxide, as a lot of things, took off online, and it was thought by many of these different groups to cause cancer. And so this patient that had come in with a construction accident in the early part of the pandemic was required to take a nose swab. He didn't take a nose swab, and with his arm literally hanging from his elbow, bloody bandages, said, I refuse to take it because I do not want to get cancer, and it was the last those emergency care doctors saw. That shows how strong information can be and how it can translate into behavior. It became such a problem in the state of Washington, so not far from here. It became such an issue, this rumor about ethylene oxide, that the health department had to create an information campaign around ethylene oxide. I mean, just some random, no one, I certainly wouldn't have predicted before the pandemic that we'd have to have a discussion about ethylene oxide. But that's how challenging it is with these vast data voids and with this infinite evidences out there. Now the next thing this is kind of both a positive and sort of a scary side of misinformation and how we need to translate this into some learnings within media literacy, is that there are tropes with misinformation. Tropes are things like in movies where you always see the bomb, tick, 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 there's always this bomb trope, there's always other kinds of tropes. Well, there are rumor tropes, and the reason why that's good is because we can use that to do the pre-bunking that people have talked about a long time, that we'll see the same thing over and over, and we should utilize that more than we actually do. So during elections, of course, there's always going to be the trope that there was mail voter registrations dumped or stolen, etc. And we can show those kinds of things before the elections happen and hopefully make an improvement. And certainly one thing that we always see, No matter what, if there's a hurricane this year, there certainly will be, there will be sharks swimming in the street, and I can almost, anyone want to bet you money right now, this exact image will probably be popping up in that particular, and everyone's like, no way, sharks swimming in the street, and you're like, no, yeah, we've seen that many times. The good news is that one of the research scientists in our center, Mike Caulfield, pushed Google for about 3 years to finally put 3 little dots in front of all search results. So if you go to Google now, you'll see this is relatively new, next to every search result, and now next to every image, where you can click on the 3 little dots right here in this image, and it'll give you metadata that Google has on it. So we can say this image was debunked by Snopes or MSNBC or whatever it is. I mean, it has all this other information, and you can see when it was debunked, or you can find if the website just was formed. So I don't know why it took all the way to 2025 to be able to finally have the tools that fact checkers have for regular adults, but that's useful, especially for the kinds of tropes that we see all the time. And so I want to be able to translate the things that we see and other researchers see and put those tropes in front of people before they happen again. Now, frames are it's a little more complicated concept, and we've done a bunch of work tracking the ways in which a frame is placed for the public, like, let's say, Stop the Steal or whatever, not Stop Steal, but that there will be, a stolen election. Then what happens is that genuine people that are genuinely just trying to figure out what's happening and whether there is evidence of some sort of claim, like stop the steal, then legitimate evidence can then be used to placed in the frame, and then those, we'll call them agents in the influential agents out in the media sphere, can then amplify those claims even when they're genuine. This is a bit how good science can be used to mislead and tell different kinds of stories. So the point here is that there's evidence out there. I told you there's infinite evidence, and sometimes that evidence is true, by the way. It's not that this is all false evidence, just made up evidence. A lot of times some of this can be true. But evidence, frames, and interpretations, the frame itself, once it's placed strategically, is highly effective at amplifying information, and we need to let the public know about these frames, a little bit like tropes, so that they can be prepared for that. But it's very effective for amplifying and gluing together different communities, and that then forms some sort of interpretation. And why does this matter? It matters because if we're going to, if we see these frames and we take those away, a little bit like if we take, wonder away from person, we need to replace that with wonder. Others have talked about this. I know that Ray has talked a little bit about these kinds of things. When you take away a story that you say is not true, you need to fill it in with another story. Same thing with frames. If we take away a frame, we need to show the kinds of frames that exist out there. Another thing I will mention is that intervention strategies and echo chambers sort of go hand in hand. I mean, we've learned a whole bunch in the field. There's been, since, for the last decade, actually multiple decades, people have been studying misinformation. And if you go onto Amazon, for example, you're going to see, tons and tons of books, and most of them are solution-oriented books about what to do about misinformation. Some talking about it. Although it is interesting that killer underwear invasion somehow shows up around that. I don't know how this recommendation algorithm pulled that one into the misinformation element. But we have learned a lot, and if I had to simplify all the interventions, and I was mentioning over the break that a recent consensus report by the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine, I was a part of this committee, where we recently put out a report on what we know, at least so far, in the field of misinformation as it relates to science. I recommend reading that. I can send you it if you're interested. But if I was to summarize at least our own research around interventions, and it's hard to do interventions online because you don't have a really strong ethical position to go and manipulate, even if you did own a platform, one of these platforms, to see whether one intervention worked better than another. But the one thing we've learned, at least through simulations and other work, is that by combining interventions and by combining skill sets when we teach people about media literacy and about critical thinking, that really is the better strategy that I've learned time and time again. Oh, yes, it's not just, of course, one strategy, and we shouldn't ever get stuck with that kind of mentality, although I see that in curriculum that's been developed. Also, we need to talk to the public about things like echo chambers, for example. We have a paper that there's mixed evidence of whether echo chambers really exist. I do think there's stronger evidence that echo chambers are a real thing online. They do have an impact on the spread of misinformation. But what we need to do, regardless, is talk to the public when we talk about media literacy and sort of critical thinking in a media literacy sort of world. I think we need to talk about these sort of systematic systematic understandings of how the information world in which they live works. That they can't just be that individual living in there. We have to give them that population level scale. So those are some of the things on media literacy. But I want to show how they interact with the things that I've been thinking about around critical thinking and trying to sort of narrow in on some of the areas that I've focused on when it comes to critical thinking. So as we all know, we're completely inundated with information, but the information that I've been really stuck on for most of my career, because I teach classes in statistics and data science and machine learning and stuff, is that I really look at the information that comes in quantitative form. In quantitative form, I think it's a good and a bad thing. I mean, it's not necessarily good or bad, I guess, in many ways, but we're seeing more and more of it over the last 20 years as things have become digitized. We have better tools for gathering data, collecting data, creating graphs, and quantitative data can be very authoritative. It's almost like it's divine and it drops from nature, and it carries this authority in ways that just words don't. And so much of it, as we know, is BS. I mean, this is one of my favorite graphs that I see in many different forms. Like, this is all you need to know according to some of these blogs when it comes to climate change. You just zoom out so far, and as I have explained, if you zoom out so far on a diagonal plot, you're going to get also a horizontal line. And so we, of course, talk to students about replotting and then looking at the implications of these kinds of things. And this led to a course that Carl and I started developing well over a decade ago, and we finally just put it out because we knew the university was probably not going to give us permission to teach it. So we broke all the rules. Sorry, this is going to be recorded. So we broke all the rules of the university, and they've heard me say it multiple times. But you usually have to go through course review at your university. We didn't go through course review. We thought it was too important, so we just put it online. Woke up the next morning, and it had gone viral. So then we went back to the university, and we said, can we teach it? And they said, yeah, you can teach it. They still don't allow us in the course reserve catalog and on transcripts to have bullshit. So we're still fighting that battle. Other universities have been able to do it, which is good. But we focus mostly on the ways in which data can mislead. We talk about things like selection bias, correlation, causation, a lot of things that we've talked about at this conference, et cetera, et cetera. And it was adapted. It's been adapted by over 200 universities have reached out. So it's been a fun sort of watching this bullshit movement. We have book in many different languages. But the reason really, I think, the work that we're doing in this community is so important really is reflected, I think, in John Alexander Smith's quote from 1914, that nothing that a student will learn in the course of their studies, and parents don't want to hear this, of course, will be the slightest possible use to them in the afterlife, save only this, that if you work hard intelligently, you should be able to detect when a human now and a machine is talking rot. And that, in my view, really is, just like John Alexander, is the sole purpose of education. I think this is the most important thing that we do in education. So if I'm going to talk about bullshit, I'll talk, I always want to give a definition. I talked about this in the book, but I want to make it clear as I move forward, talking about some of the ways in which I teach critical thinking of data, that bullshit involves language, of course, intended to impress, overwhelm, and persuade, and it's presented with a disregard to truth. So Harry Frankfurt, for example, distinguished that from liars. So liars know the truth and they move you the other direction. Bullshitters don't really care about the truth. They're just trying to impress. They're just trying to persuade. And a great example of this, actually it's my favorite, Carl and I got a kick out of when finding these different examples, but Sigmund Freud's example is probably my favorite. He wrote about this as he had his girlfriend at the time, and he was telling her about his lecture. So he says, so I gave my lecture yesterday. Despite of lack of preparation, I spoke well and without hesitation, which I ascribed to the cocaine I had taken beforehand. So we kind of know this. And I told about my discoveries in brain anatomy, all very difficult things that the audience certainly didn't understand, but all that matters is they get the impression that I understand. And we've all been there to some degree. I mean, bullshit is just very much a part of human communication, but this is an example of what I consider bullshit. But bullshit is more than just language. Bullshit, really, as I said, are statistical figures, data graphics, other forms of presentation. And it's here where I think that we really want to, where I've wanted to spend a lot of my time, thinking, going beyond just sort of bullshit as words and numbers carrying this authority and having really kind of this divine authority. And that's why I think at least 37% of lectures include made-up statistics. All right, good. I knew this crowd would get this one first. Sometimes I've said that and the crowds don't get it, but I knew this one would get it. That's good. You all pass. You all pass the class. That's good. But in all reality, we see this all the time. And this is an example. We talked about this a little bit in one of the examples yesterday. And so I pulled this one up. This is an old one that I've used before, but it relates to a couple things that were said yesterday. And here, Breitbart had published this article. This was many years ago. And it relates, of course, to what's happening in the United States right now. And it says that 2,139 DACA recipients convicted or accused of crimes against Americans. This heavy, weighty, big number, right? Scary. Turns out that's not a lie. That's actually, I might find many examples where the numbers are lied and made up. That's not a lie. But what should we always be telling our students when they see this? Numbers should be presented in context. That means they have to allow for comparisons. And so it's not this that we're cared about. What we care is that it's 0.3% of DACA recipients versus 8.6% of general Americans that are convicted of felony. And this is by this way. I can find like a dozen current examples that almost follow the same recipe that don't do this comparison. Now, during COVID, we saw all sorts of things that sort of really take a step into science, which is, of course, why I care so much about teaching science, and I know all of you as well, and teaching the importance of distinguishing science from pseudoscience. But even when it's legitimate science, I pick ones because we can study which ones go viral, and I can tell you this one went so viral. Bald men at higher risk of severe coronavirus symptoms. And Carl and I were like, wow, okay, this is real. Let's go look at where this journal, follow the source as we tell the students, and we look, and it's in a legitimate journal. This is not a predatory journal. It's a real journal. They had a mechanism behind it. They had a hypothesis that there was some endocrine involvement in COVID pathogenesis, and that seemed pretty good. But they forgot a really important common cause. Anyone know what that was? Oh, you guys are, you guys are spot on. I don't know, I need to make these a little harder. You're so good on it. Yes, exactly. And Forbes and many others had to do a retraction. But these are professional journalists. This was published in a peer-reviewed journal. I can give you tons of examples. So many times we need to be reflective of our own institution in science. Of course, science is still the institution that I certainly would rely on. It has its challenges, and I write about misinformation in science itself and about science. But still, we should be doing this reflectively. And by the way, for the public, it's not so easy because something like this looks like a real paper. It does. In fact, this is in a journal. Expected results show that a longer nose means slower times for passing the salt and pepper, a second report. Turns out I have this game essentially similar to the games we had before where I do, is this a predatory journal or not a predatory journal? And the public, of course, has a hard time doing this, but I've done this with tenure, professors at campus, experienced scientists outside of academia. They struggle because it is hard, and it's also still a little fuzzy on how we define predatory. By the way, this is classified by another group that does a lot of this as predatory, so don't worry, this is one. But when I play the game, I'm amazed at how challenging it is for all of us, and I've missed many of these as well. And I've been doing a lot of work now doing building some new education, new workshops and new sort of vignettes around some of the common things that we're seeing in science so that we ourselves are not as susceptible. So Carl and I and others are working on developing new sort of education program around things like p-hacking, which Chris had mentioned, and also outcome switching, etc. But the corporate world we need to be out there talking to them too, because they are seen as trusted. If you look at some trust metrics, sometimes they're trusted, sometimes they're not. But when we talk about Venn diagrams in my class, I do enjoy finding all the ways in which Venn diagrams, which you think would be very simple to explain, are always mutilated by many of our leaders in the corporate world. So, and Thomson Reuters is a Canadian company, so I thought I'd pull this one out. So make sure if you're going to come up with a Venn diagram, don't create one that makes you look this bad. I have many U.S. companies, more U.S. companies examples as well, too. But really at the core of the critical thinking schema that I use when talking to students and the public about this is that you don't have to have a PhD in statistics, you don't have to have a PhD in computer science to call bullshit on a lot of the low quality information that comes wrapped in numbers and technology. So what we do is we focus all the attention on the input data or the output and the interpretation using various forms of old-fashioned critical thinking, and we have people ignore the black box algorithm. Because in all of my experience over the years reviewing hundreds and hundreds of papers and proposals, very rarely is the problem in the black box. It almost always is in the data input. I'll give you an example as I now go into the last part of my talk focused on AI. So during the pandemic, there was all sorts of proposals and excitement and papers and news articles written about how AI could detect pneumonia sooner than any radiologist. It's still happening today, lots of discussions about this, and it's not that we shouldn't try to do that, and it's not that it can't do some things, but in using that schema, I can show how one very popular paper that got a lot of attention can be easily debunked with that schema. And that here was this idea that you could use this, and the ideas, or the connecting ideas, we use a lot of these causal diagrams. Dotted line just means an association and no causal direction. Here you have system learns features correlate with disease state, so you don't know yet, depending on the results, whether disease state and image features have a causative link. But of course, that's where we want to go if you have AI that could diagnostically do this kind of work. Long story short, it turns out that it can't see anything magical that a radiologist isn't seeing around the etiology of the disease. What AI was seeing in many of these examples were metadata and ancillary things like was the image taken in supine position? Was it in an outpatient, inpatient? Those are the variables that it used. And yes, it made good predictions. And for when doing that, it just wasn't that it saw something magical in the patterns of the pneumonia itself. And so the hospital itself was a better detector, and you didn't necessarily need AI to do it. So it was looking at these various different features. And this commonly happens when we overhype and give too much credit to AI, which is, again, only using the black box schema. So, as we were teaching this many years before, ChatGPT came along. In fact, in autumn 2019, we started playing around like a lot of different labs with GPT-2, and GPT-2 itself was quite impressive. And then by, of course, November essentially of 2022, ChatGPT really seemed to kind of come out of nowhere. I mean, I track this because I work in a computer science field and department and associate with computer science department, and this was different. And so I won't deny that what we're seeing is a little bit different. I do think it's overhyped, but this does seem like this alien technology that's essentially hijacked our, you could think of it as an operating system of humanity. That some people have talked about this, other philosophers that talk about this, and people that write about technology. But I think it's an important thing I like Ted Edwards' quote about this, that as in any fairy tale, accepting magical assistance really does come with some serious risks. So be careful of that. So now in 2025, ChatGPT is ubiquitous. We know our students are using it, whether they say they're not or they're not. Faculty are using it, whether they say they are or not. And so the real question is, what do our students need to learn and thrive in this new LLM world? So Colin and I have released a new course. It's called Modern Day Oracles or Bullshit Machines. And it focuses on, of course, large language models. We talk a little bit about other forms of AI, but we're mostly talking about large language models. And we bring a lot of the concepts from the original work on bullshit studies, which I think is a real thing. Hopefully, I even put it on my CV, bullshit studies. But the most important thing about, and I'll mention some of the great things they do, but I think one of the greatest strengths of LLMs is their ability to bullshit, but it's also their greatest danger. And so I think it's really important that we talk about it, and I'll hopefully try to convince you of that. Now, you can go to this course. I'm not going to go through everything. We have 18 different lessons that we expand. We have instructors' lessons. Feel free to use it. Just let us know if you're using it. That's the only thing we ask, but we make it all freely available. But I have to confess a bias first, and that is my first exposure to these modern large language models was when Meta released what's called Galactica. And at the time, Galactica was only up, it seemed like a couple hours. It was more than that, a couple days or whatever. But Galactica was supposed to be the solution to just doing science completely different. Just like anything that comes out of Silicon Valley or technology, it was the solution to everything, Galactica. So Carl and I wanted to ask a very simple question. We wanted to see if it could answer one of the simplest questions in bullshit studies, which was about Brandolini's law. This is a real law. This is a real entry in Wikipedia that says that it's basically this idea that it's easy to create bullshit, very hard to clean it up. So we asked Galactica. We said, okay, tell us about Brandolini's bullshit principle. We asked it, and here's what it said. It said, Brandolini's law, or Brandolini's rule, is a theory in economics, not true, proposed by Gianni Brandolini, professor at University of Padua, not true. What states that the smaller the economic, the greater efficiency, not true, not true, not true. It was essentially bullshitting the bullshit principle. And that, for me, has affected me. I have to confess, I have a bias. Every time I deal with these things, I know that that is a core of sort of what they do. Of course, they're improving, and they have improved since then. And they do amazing things. Carl and I were messing around with whether they could code up from scratch Space Invaders. You know, it's something that we wanted. Both were like saying, "Oh, we would have wanted to do this as kids," and it provides the code, and it does it. So it does amazing things. But at the same time, when you look at the outputs from some of these other forms, whether it's Gemini or these other ways that LLMs have been integrated to search, etc., you get things like this. Is there a country in Africa that starts with K? Well, while there are 54 recognized countries in Africa, none of them begin with the letter K. The closest is Kenya, which starts with a K sound, but is actually spelled with a K. You know, this is stuff, and this took a long time for Google to finally fix, because me and several others were like, it can't even fix this one. And partly it's because it's gobbling up garbage that's hallucinating, and so much of our web is being created with content that it doesn't have that verification. So critical thinking is even more important. Then even just questions about my own university. You know, of course, I could go on and on. I'm not going to give a couple of these because there's just infinite number of examples of these. But how many U.S. presidents have graduated from the university that I work at? It says 4 U.S. presidents. Not true. Graduated from the university, including Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Monroe, John Tyler. I never knew all this. This is amazing. And of course, it fails in many of the ways that other forms of sort of reasoning works. Like, of course, around math and stuff. This is where we have to talk to the students in public around where it fails miserably. Like if you ask it, how much is the annual salary for $50 an hour? It then breaks this up. Top earners are 127,000, 75th percentile is 64,000, average is 67,000. I mean, anyone who knows basic math sees how problematic that is. And it'll even come up with just made-up distributions for jobs that don't even exist. So we asked it in its version from ZipRecruiter, what if I wanted to be a bullshit machinist salary? What would I make? It just makes up this stuff here and says, like, this is current stuff. This isn't just something I did back in August or November of 2022. And then, but look, one thing I did learn from all this is that if you're a modern day Oracle, you make a lot more money than if you're a bullshit caller. So that's usually what it is. The bullshitters, the critical thinker teachers, we don't make as much money as the oracles out there. So I want to talk about, just end with a couple other concepts here that I think are pretty important as I think about how we integrate this. And this has to do with the recent paper that my colleagues and I published in PNAS that came out just actually a few weeks ago or a month or so ago. And this really looks at, this isn't the paper. This is the paper I'm going to talk about. But I am going to say there's been lots of evidence, or the evidence going both ways. So I think it's too early to tell what the effects are on learning. But a recent paper, I could give you like a stack of papers that show where it sometimes helps with some kind of learning and hurts in other ways. These are examples that it's not helpful for software engineers, not helpful for maths, not helpful for writing, etc. And I think we'll wait to hear more of those until we make big conclusions. But what I do want to say is that there hasn't been enough attention on what I call, well, it's not what I call, but it's the communicative side rather than just the cognitive side of these technologies. This is a paper that I was mentioned that we published a couple months ago in PNAS. And really, it's forced me to almost do this little gestalt shift in how I look at this technology and how I think about it when I think about critical reasoning as we move forward in this AI world. So much of the tension on the research side and the discussions that you hear in blogs, in podcasts, and in the news is on the cognitive side. Does it have the ability, for example, to do an analogy test? Can it do zero-shot reasoning? Does it have theory of mind, et cetera, et cetera? And I think less attention is on the communicative side. So if you look at the research, testing of theory of mind, large language models theory of mind, this whole machine psychology. Well, I know there's a lot of psychologists out there, and just if you haven't been tracking this, computer scientists have become enamored with psychology now. They're looking at all the psychology tests and benchmarks and evaluations, and they're saying, look, we're just going to just take those same things and apply it to machines, and there's so many problems with it. But there are literally thousands of papers on this. There was a high-profile paper that got so much attention, and I wrote a response to it with my student to explain why this was so problematic. It got so much attention. It was saying you basically could do zero-shot learning with these large language models. But how do you know it's zero-shot? Zero-shot is essentially not ever seeing the problem. But how do you know that it hasn't seen the problem? And how do you then make those conclusions? So to give you an example of its own reasoning ability, if you asked it to do an analogy, you'd have A, B, C, D. That's just a typical string analogy. Then how would you finish that? It would be I, J, K, L, M. And if you look at their results, they say, there's the humans, and there's ChatGPT. Look, ChatGPT not only does just as well, it actually exceeds humans in letter string analogies. But what's the obvious alternative hypothesis to this? It's memorizing the data it's already seen. It's basically gobbling up all of the internet. You can't tell me they don't have those examples online. So what we did is just a very simple thing. We said, let's create an alphabet or extend those sequences. So we had an alternate alphabet that likely didn't exist. It could exist, it's still on the internet. Or extend these sequences. And when you do that, it fails miserably. And so, yes, it may have some reasoning ability, and chain of thought has changed things a little bit, but there is truly this brittleness. So if you look at the way it extends the sequences, it goes way down, way down. Basically, it fails at this. And there's this theme of generative brittleness. So that's my sort of view on them as their own sort of reasoners, but it's not that I care all that much. It's on the communicative side. So anyone who's watched Star Trek or likes science fiction like me, many of the depictions of these humanoids for many, many decades talking about this really had this view of, which is almost flipped from what we have today. So anyone know who this is? Lieutenant Commander Data, yes. And if you know about that character, he was depicted as a humanoid that really had almost kind of infinite knowledge. You could depend on him like you could a computer. If I put in something like into the calculator and get an answer, you couldn't expect that. But where he was weak was on the communicative side. Couldn't quite pick up humor. There was all sorts of shows about all the human sides of things. He didn't have, even though he was an embodied humanoid, and we don't have that with LLMs, which is actually really important, the communicative side was the weak side. But what these things have been optimized for is the communicative side. So as we think of the social learning aspect of critical thinking, we really need to be thinking about this communicative side. And there's been a little bit of research in this space, and what's interesting is that these things are great at writing persuasive articles. They're really good at that because, again, they're optimized for communicative abilities. They're really good at inferring sentiment, amazing at that. The third thing is they're great at role-playing. Those three things make them great bullshitters. They make them incredibly powerful at making us think they're good, and it really should make us think about how we should design and even write policy and, of course, build education around them based on their communicative, not their cognitive. All the attention is on the cognitive. And I want to be very clear here. LLMs do not possess any human traits in any genuine sense, even though this is talked about all the time. And there's a debate on a 3-hour program on podcast. But LLMs aren't conscious. They're essentially autocomplete machines on steroids, which is amazing that autocomplete machines can do what they do. But they're not afraid of you turning them off at this point. Now, this may change, and maybe you regret it. Hopefully, I don't regret it too much. And they don't express any sort of moral sentiment. Yet this is where all the conversation's going. And so we've been told by many of my colleagues and great scholars out there, stop anthropomorphizing. But there's a problem. This was depicted in Ex Machina, which is what this shows. I mean, I could have put any character, so I don't mean to be anthropomorphic seduction just on this character. But it's more than just telling the public not to anthropomorphize this. There's been research, essentially, that shows why you shouldn't anthropomorphize, because then you're more susceptible. But the problem is they're already anthropomorphic. And there's evidence, and I showed you there's enough, not as much on the communicative side, but they already are anthropomorphic. So these arguments to not anthropomorphize fall flat. And we know this. If you look at the Turing test, it's not passing the Turing test, which is an amazing, from my field of computer science, this is one of the biggest things that didn't get celebrated. They essentially passed at least the version that most people consider what Turing himself wrote on the back of the napkin. This is this idea that if you go behind a curtain and then you had a real human and then a computer, and you had this interaction, to pass the Turing test for the computer, you wouldn't be able to tell which one's human and which one's computer. You do this, many, many times. Well, we've blown through that with these machines. But they're passing it not because of cognitive ability. And cognitive and communicative have overlap. So I want to address that. But it's mostly on these communicative side. So what that means is that when we interact with them on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog sort of thing. Well, nobody knows you're ChatGPT anymore because of that communicative ability. So as we talk to the public, we talk to students about this, we need to really be distinguishing between anthropomorphism and anthropomorphic systems. And there are implications, of course, for science. Certainly, on the just production side, the thing I worry about, of course, is the overflood, and it's being used all the time. We did some detection of this, and others have found this. If you are going to use generative AI, please don't put in the introduction, certainly, here is your possible introduction for your topic. Or, I'm very sorry, but I don't have access to real information. This was published in Elsevier journals. So this passed the other authors, peer review, the editor. This is how bad it's become. And so we start detecting for these things, and you can find them all over the place. You basically look for these rote comments from AI. I'll give you another example. So I was one of 2 witnesses for a case in the state of Minnesota around synthetic media, in particular deepfakes. The other person was a Stanford professor, and I don't want to call names to that because everyone makes mistakes here, but it was a pretty big mistake. Stanford professor that actually studies synthetic media and AI and talks about being careful with it. Well, in that case, the case was almost thrown out because the Stanford misinformation expert used ChatGPT for his testimony, and the way they figured it out was that the references didn't exist. They were hallucinating. So when we talk about the public and teaching them, it's happening at all levels. And so we need to get on top of this. And of course, there's all this overhype around these new tools, like Sakana came out with this AI scientist, which is going to basically do end-to-end science, do the hypothesis generation, do the experiments, do the peer review, do the writing. Well, then what's humans for? Well, as I always say, science is not about a pile of papers. It's a social process that does involve those humans. But even worse than that, and evidence that we're finding in other groups, is that these things are used to flood discussions about science-related topics like climate misinformation. And this actually was happening in Canada. I put this example because this was up in Canada happening. So we have a problem and we have a challenge when it comes to teaching both the media literacy and the critical reasoning side, critical thinking side of AI. And as we've all seen, there's hallucinations and hallucitations. These are just my own hallucitations. And so people have, a lot of the engineers have tried to re-engineer this and try to build those more reliable citations into things. But the important thing that I want us to recognize as we teach sort of modern day sort of epistemology with these AI agents is that these are done post hoc. If you see citations associated with an output from an LLM, it's not because they're building on the knowledge. They're doing it post hoc. They're doing basically cosine similarity after the fact and finding articles that share the same language. And that has implications. I'll give you an example, and then I'm almost done. There's the last couple of slides. So we've done some work looking at this new world, this amalgam world of search and now AI being at the top of many of our results. When it comes to science, this is problematic. So we have many examples where if you were to ask or misspell, for example, abortion, and you look at the advice that it gives, I won't go into all the detail, but basically this gave not just the wrong advice, the opposite advice that you would give to a woman considering an abortion. And why is that? Why is that? And we see this time and time again when it comes to different kinds of science topics. The reason why this is happening, this is my own theory and we're beginning to test this, is that these machines are using our language, and in their space of learning, two things are close together in their dimension of in sort of how they learn the world based on textual similarity. It's not whether something's true or not. It doesn't have truth labels of whether you should take this drug or you shouldn't take this drug. So if I was to say Ed Sheeran, and I've done this example through searches on LLMs, Ed Sheeran doesn't have a song called The Crow. Ed Sheeran has a song called The Crow. For humans, that's very different, right? Very, very different. But to an LLM, those are essentially the same. This is how the LLM sees the world. They're exactly the same, even though they're very different in our world. So let me go back. I think this is an important point as we teach the public how these machines work and what to look out for as you work with them to do your critical thinking. Ed Sheeran has a song or doesn't have a song means very, very different thing for us as humans, but as LLMs, they're the same. So that's why we get in a lot of our results zero, like it describes the treatment or the drug you should take, but whether you should use it or not gets flipped back and forth. And so that is something that's not conveyed, and these are the kinds of many things that we need to be talking about as we start to learn this. So, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we could talk that I could talk about. I do want to just say that there are really some important distinctions, and my colleagues and I have some colleagues at University of Sydney, Kai and Sandra, were working on a paper looking at the differences between human cognition and sort of these new, this alien technology cognition. And there's a whole bunch of differences, but some of the big ones are they don't have an embodied experience like we do. That actually matters for cognition, not that I'm a cognitive psychologist, but that matters. Temporality matters. They only respond to these kinds of prompts. But most importantly, I want to say this, that I've been studying social media, online media, national media. I've been studying science institutions and now studying AI. And the thing that I fear, one of the things I fear the most is that we are becoming more and more separated. We're not coming together like we used to talk about in the 1990s. Like, look, the internet's going to bring us together. It's going to democratize information. It's doing the opposite. We're getting further apart, and I think AI is going to be a wedge for that. Not a wedge just for democracy, but a wedge for individuals. And I think as we try to think about the next form of critical thinking in the modern world and media literacy in the modern world, we need to find ways to bring us together. And that's why I think this conference is the perfect thing to be thinking about this. And that's it for now. So thanks so much. Thanks. All right.
This was amazing. I think we can take like 2 questions before we move over to the panel. Yes?
Thoughts on debunk plot, useful in the classroom, what do you think about it?
Just like all of these things, and as scientists, we're always talking in caveats, and when we talk to the public, they want to hear, like, yes, it works or not, but I'm going to give you that caveat speech, which is we just have to be careful. I even though I take more of a critique view on these things, but I do recognize the power, and I do recognize the things that they can do. And so I don't want us to not do the research. I don't want us to not experiment. In fact, I encourage it in my class. I've had to change, like any of us, have had to change our classes because of it. Some things are working, some things aren't. I can tell you all about that over dinner or whatever, what I think is working, at least in my classroom. But with that particular example, I think we should experiment, but we should experiment like we do in the actual research lab. That we almost need human subjects, which it might be another version of human subjects. It'll be like our own subjects, like, okay, we got to know what the consequences of actually going down this route. Maybe really think about random control trials. I want us to learn now. We have the tools to learn. We're scientists, we're researchers, we should know that. But we just need to know that there are consequences to this. And even all the other basic things like privacy too, and understand some of the baseline hallucination rates. I mean, we need to be aware of it, but they're here to stay, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that when you posted several of the tweets, it was kind of about the ballots. It's funny how a lot of the comments is a general pattern I see, at least, where there's people at the end of saying some sort of rumor, they always say big if true.
Yes.
I think that's a funny thing. I wonder if it's like encouraging to look deeper into it as more of a rumor. I didn't see it, But my actual question was about I was talking about the 3 dots and it will show you different articles.
Yes.
Is that going to work, or does it already work with AI or deepfake kind of issues?
So that's a good question. So it's relatively new for Google. Google saw it as an experimental feature on their website. They got huge usage on it and decided to keep it still there. And I wake up when I start, it's still there. And they have, on some of the ones that I've used, will show something that had been fact-checked, if it had been fact-checked or existed somewhere in their metadata, whether it was a deepfake. Now, they do have the they have the groups that probably could do some detection like in real time on it. I'm sure it would be computationally very expensive for them, but that would be amazing to then also add it like a run, a deepfake detection. I was a part of this nonprofit that it's called TrueMedia.org. Unfortunately, we didn't have a funding model, but we did provide all these tools free during the elections for journalists and the public to use to do deepfake stuff. So those tools exist out there. They're still out there. That maybe if someone was clever, they could build a web extension that would allow, like, as soon as you clicked on the three dots, if it was an image, it would quickly run and see if there was a likelihood of a deepfake. I mean, we only know them probabilistically. I mean, deepfakes are getting better and better, and they're harder and harder. I do want to say something about the big if true. There's partially a good aspect to that at least people are saying, well, this might be true, but of course, it's just a hook that people are getting. But in science, we've actually, there's been some proposals about how to incorporate that to do some more innovative science. At least this is on the positive side of that. And one of these journals, I gotta remember the journal, has a section that's big if true. So it allows some risk. So there is a positive side, but at least what we see on social media, the big if true is basically people's a way to fan rumors, and that's usually can be problematic. So anyway, thanks for the question.